The silence at Grimwald Manor wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence. It pressed against her eardrums like deep water, a suffocating weight that promised to drown everything she had ever known about music. This was a place where notes died before they were born. The descent was longer than she'd expected. Each turn of the spiral staircase took them deeper into the earth, the air growing colder, heavier, and smelling of ozone and damp stone. Cornelius Crow led the way, his steps precise, his back a rigid line in the gloom. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who has walked the same path 10,000 times. Ianthe followed, her hand trailing along the sweating granite wall, her therapist's mind trying to piece together the case file. Extreme, prolonged agoraphobia with catatonic features. The description was a sterile medical mask for what she was beginning to suspect was a profound, festering strangeness. "The acoustics down here are unusual," she said, her voice swallowed instantly by the stone. "No hecho, no reverberación." Just a flat, dead finality. Crow paused at the bottom, his hand on a colossal, iron-banded door. He turned his head slightly, and the weak light from a sconce glinted off the small, flesh-colored device tucked into his ear. A hearing aid that explained his clipped, overly loud speech in the car. It was a small, humanizing detail that did little to ease the knot tightening in her stomach. "Lord Oberon has particular needs," Crow stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "Silence is paramount." He produced a key that looked more like a medieval scepter and slid it into a lock the size of her fist. The grinding of tumblers was a deafening intrusion, a series of metallic shrieks that seemed to physically wound the quiet. The door swung inward, not with a creak, but with the smooth, heavy swing of a bank vault. The air that washed over her was ancient. It carried the scent of dust, not from years, but from centuries, and a faint, electric tang that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The room was not a bedroom, nor a study, nor any kind of living space she could comprehend. It was a throne room carved from the bedrock, vast and circular. And in its center, on a throne of what looked like fused, blackened iron, sat Lord Oberon Grimwald. He was not the frail, withered recluse she had imagined. He was a man carved from marble and shadow, impossibly still. Long, ink-black hair spilled over his shoulders, framing a face of aristocratic beauty frozen in a mask of utter neutrality. He was bound to the throne with thick, dark chains at his wrists, his ankles, his throat. They were not for restraint, she realized with a jolt of cold dread. They were anchors holding him down. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were open, staring into the middle distance, and they were not the eyes of a man. They were perfect, polished voids, twin pools of pure black that seemed to drink the meager light. No iris, no pupil, just an endless, starless night. He wasn't looking at anything. He was simply enduring. A low, constant hum emanated from him, a vibration she felt more in her bones than heard with her ears. It was the source of the electric charge in the air, a thrum of suppressed energy, so immense it felt like standing next to a power station. He was a coiled spring, a storm held in stasis. The catatonia wasn't a symptom. It was a cage of flesh he had built around a furnace. Crow moved to the side, his posture that of a guard, an observer. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. This was it, the session. Ianthe swallowed, the professional in her wrestling with the primal urge to flee. She was a music therapist, a healer. This man, this entity, was a wound in the world. How could she possibly begin? She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her boots scuffing softly on the stone floor. The sound vanished. She drew a breath, focusing on her training. Build a rapport. Assess the environment. Find a point of connection. In a space designed to kill sound, sound itself was the only tool she had. She didn't try to speak. Words felt pointless here, vulgar. Instead, she did the simplest thing she could think of. A diagnostic test, a way to gauge the room's deadened response. She closed her eyes for a second, centered herself, and hummed. It was just a single note. A clear, perfect A440. A musician's tuning fork, a pure tone with no emotion attached. The world stopped. The low vibration emanating from the throne ceased so abruptly that the ensuing silence was a physical blow. The air, once charged, became a vacuum. The pressure in her ears changed, a painful, popping sensation. A film of ice seemed to flash freeze across the stone floor, the chill biting through the soles of her boots. She opened her eyes. Crow had gone rigid, his hand hovering over a device on his belt. But his attention was fixed on the throne. Lord Oberon's head had moved. It was a fractional turn, a tremor, but after an eternity of stillness, it was an earthquake. And then he blinked. Slowly, his eyelids lowered and then raised, a gesture of impossible weight. The black voids of his eyes settled on her, and for the first time, she felt seen. Not observed, but pierced through, her entire history laid bare and found wanting. The stillness was broken. The statue was now a predator. A voice, like the grinding of tectonic plates, scraped from his throat. It was rough with disuse, a dry, rasping sound that was more memory than voice. Again, the word hung in the dead air, a command, a plea. Ianthe stood frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The hum had been a key, and she had just turned it in a lock she never should have touched. Sing, the man on the throne whispered, the sound cracking with a desperation that was terrifyingly human. Please. As you can see, Miss Lyric, Crow interjected, his voice tight, strained, your services are precisely what is required. He stepped forward, pulling her attention away from the chained figure. He withdrew a sleek black checkbook and a pen. Your fee, plus a bonus. 200,000 pounds. For one night. Your full repertoire. Lullabies, hymns, whatever you have. You will fill this space with sound from dusk until dawn. 200,000 pounds. The number was ludicrous, a fantasy. It would solve every problem she had, erase every debt, rewrite her entire life. All for a night of singing to a man chained to a throne in the deep dark. Her mind raced, a maelstrom of fear and avarice. This wasn't therapy. This was an exorcism or an appeasement. She was being hired to soothe something that should not be soothed, to cage a nightmare with melody. She looked from Crow's impassive face back to the throne. Oberon was watching her, the black voids of his eyes holding an eternity of suffering. The choice felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, a choice between a life of freedom and a night she might not survive. His lips parted again, the whisper reaching her across the impossible silence, meant for her alone. Do not stop, he breathed, the words a wisp of frost in the frigid air, or we all die. The velvet of the chair felt like a shroud against her back. Ianthe drew a slow, measured breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and something metallic, like a forgotten storm. Across from her, Oberon was a statue carved from sleeplessness, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny and more like a plea. Crow stood by the door, a sentinel of grim necessity, his arms crossed. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was a pressurized vessel, waiting for her voice to be the crack that broke it. She began, not with a grand aria, but a lullaby her grandmother used to hum. A simple melody, almost a whisper of notes, woven from memory and a desperate hope for peace. The first few bars felt thin, swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the chamber. Oberon's posture didn't change. His gaze remained locked. Ianthe pushed on, letting the melody swell, pouring a little more of herself into the sound. She sang of twilight fields and the first evening star, of things gentle and final. It was a song about surrender. Her voice, usually a tool of precise emotional calibration, became a lifeline thrown into a silent abyss. Then she saw it, a flicker. The tension in Oberon's jaw eased by a fraction. His eyelids, those two terrible curtains he fought to keep raised, trembled. The song deepened, flowing from her not as a performance, but as a current. The air in the room seemed to thin, to grow colder. She felt a faint, deep vibration through the soles of her shoes, a groan from the very bones of the manor. Oberon's head listed to one side. His breathing, once a shallow, frantic rhythm, lengthened into a soft, even cadence. His eyes, for the first time since she had arrived, slid closed. The sight was so profound, so monumental, that her voice almost caught in her throat. She held the note, a long, shimmering tone of pure cello resonance, sustaining the piece. A sharp crack echoed from the far wall, loud as a pistol shot. Ianthe flinched. Crow's head snapped towards the sound. A hairline fracture had appeared in the plaster, a white spiderweb against the dark wood paneling. At the same moment, the single, perfect rose in a vase on the bedside table seemed to sigh. Its petals, a deep, velvety crimson, curled at the edges, turning the color of dried blood. It withered before her eyes, a time lapse of decay compressed into a single, horrifying second. Entropy. Her music wasn't creating peace, it was displacing the chaos. It was feeding the silence in him, and the house, this ancient, symbiotic organism, was paying the price. Crow caught her eye, his expression a grim mixture of triumph and terror. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Continue. She sang until her throat was raw, sustaining the fragile slumber while the room around her aged. Dust stirred from the ceiling, and the window panes rattled with a wind that wasn't there. Oberon slept, and Grimwald Manor screamed. In the days that followed, a strange and precarious routine took hold. The sessions were draining rituals of exchange. Ianthe would sing. Oberon would find a few precious hours of sleep, and some new wound would appear on the house's flesh. A patch of frost on a summer window, a grandfather clock whose hands spun backwards, a string of pearls in a display case that crumbled to dust. But it was the hours between, when Oberon was awake, that began to unnerve and captivate her in equal measure. He was not the broken thing she had first seen. Awake, he was possessed of a quiet, startling lucidity. He would ask her to sit with him, not in the oppressive gloom of his chamber, but in the vast, sun-starved library. "Tell me about the color of the sea," he said one afternoon, his voice a soft rasp. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder. He was terrified of his own eyelids, she realized. Every blink was a gamble, a potential slip into the abyss he so feared. "Which sea?" she asked, her own voice gentle. "One you remember fondly." Ianthe thought of a trip to the coast with her father, before he'd gotten sick. It was the color of slate, just before a storm. But when the sun broke through, there were shards of emerald and silver in the waves. He smiled, a faint, melancholic curving of his lips. "I remember silver. We had a silver tea service. It felt cold to the touch." "Is the sea cold?" "Yes. It steals your breath at first." "I know that feeling," he murmured, and the moment of connection was so sharp, so painful, it felt like a shard of ice in her own chest. They spoke of music, of books he could no longer read, of the world outside, the perpetually weeping willows of the estate. He was intelligent, thoughtful, with a soul eroded by centuries of vigilance. He never spoke of his condition, never named the thing that kept him awake. It was the great, unspoken third person in every conversation. He was a man holding a door closed against a hurricane, and the strain was visible in every line of his face. She found herself feeling a dangerous empathy. It went beyond professional concern. It was a profound, aching pity for the prisoner, not the patient. Crow watched their interactions with a hawk's eye, his presence a constant, low hum of warning. He would interrupt them with a tray of tea or a sharp reminder of the time, his disapproval a palpable force. He was the warden, and she was fraternizing with the inmate. But she couldn't help it. In Oberon's waking moments, she saw the man the monster was consuming. One evening, he asked her to describe a train. He hadn't seen one in over a century. "They're faster now," she explained. "Sleek, not like the old steam engines. They move with a kind of electric hum." "A hum," he repeated, tasting the word. "I miss humming. The idle sounds of the world. A man whistling as he walks, a kettle reaching the boil, the drone of a bee in a lavender bush." His gaze finally met hers, and his eyes were bottomless wells of loss. My world is so quiet, Miss Lyric. Terribly, terribly quiet. Until you sing. The intimacy of the admission hung in the air between them. He wasn't just a patient. He was a man starved of the most fundamental sensory input, the background noise of life. And she was, for a few hours a day, his only nourishment. The thought was both gratifying and terrifying. The responsibility of it settled on her shoulders, heavy as a leaden cloak. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered the halls. The manor was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and locked doors. Crow's study, however, was ajar. A single lamp cast a pool of amber light onto a desk buried in charts and books. Curiosity, a reckless and powerful urge, pulled her in. She told herself she was looking for a book on acoustic resonance, something to explain the house's strange reactions. It was a lie, and she knew it. The room was Spartan, clinical. Unlike the rest of the manor's decaying grandeur, this space was one of cold function. And on the desk, beside a seismograph pen that traced the manor's groans onto a roll of paper, was a leather-bound logbook. Crow's handwriting was a precise, angular script. The latest entry was dated that very day. Session 14. Subject lapsed in a stage 2 sleep after 8.7 minutes of vocal stimulus. E-flat minor, lyrical. Structural integrity of west wing compromised. Significant entropic decay in conservatory flora. The therapy is effective, but the cost escalates. The vessel weakens. The vessel, not the patient. Her blood ran cold. She flipped back the pages, her hands trembling. The entries went back years, decades. They were less a medical journal and more the notes of a physicist observing a catastrophic, contained reaction. And then she found it. An entry from years ago, underlined twice. The ink was faded, the handwriting more agitated. Midpoint revelation. Reevaluation of core hypothesis necessary. Previous doctors assumed the sleeplessness was the pathology. They were wrong. The sleeplessness is the defense mechanism. The subject, Oberon Grimwald, is not sick. He is a cage. Inside him, bound to his consciousness, resides an entity I have designated the fugue. Analysis of its behavior indicates a singular, terrifying nature. It is an auditory parasite. It feeds on the absence of sound. Complete silence is its nourishment, its native state. Complex sound waves, particularly the resonant frequencies of a human voice, are anathema to it. They do not soothe it, they starve it. They cause it physical pain. My predecessor believed music therapy could cure the subject. Fool! The music is not a cure. It is a weapon. We are not healing Lord Grimwald. We are using his body as a battleground, torturing the entity within him to keep it dormant. His exhaustion, his madness. It is the suffering of a man forced to be the warden of his own demon, a warden who can never, ever sleep, lest the guard fall and the prisoner walk free. The book fell from her hands, slapping against the floorboards with a sound that made her jump. It all crashed into place. The cracking walls, the withering flowers, his terror of sleep, Crow's grim satisfaction. She wasn't a therapist. She was an executioner, slowly killing a thing she couldn't see, and using Oberon's soul as the whetstone for her blade. The lullabies she sang were not songs of peace. They were anthems of war. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Crow stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't need to ask what she had done. The open logbook on the floor was accusation enough. "You were not meant to see that," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You lied to me," she whispered, the words catching her throat. "He's not sick. He's a prison." "He is what he must be," Crow countered, stepping into the room. "And you're the tool we use to maintain the walls. Nothing more." The clinical cruelty of his words stripped the last of her naivete away. "What is it? This? Fugue." "It is silence given hunger. A formless dread from before men learned to speak. It found a host in his bloodline centuries ago. It is a passenger, and as long as Oberon lives, as long as he remains awake, it is contained. Your music forces it into a state of hibernation. A painful one. A memory surfaced. Oberon's soft voice, "My world is so quiet," Miss Lyric. He wasn't craving sound. He was terrified of the silence that would unleash the thing inside him. Crow retrieved the logbook, his movements precise and final. "Your sessions will continue. You have a contract. Now you simply understand the stakes." He was dismissing her, a functionary who had overstepped. As she backed out of the room, his final words followed her down the hall. "Do not pity him. Pity will get you killed. The fugue is aware of you now. It knows you are the source of its pain." Sleep offered no escape that night. When she finally drifted into a shallow, unrestful doze, the dream came. She was in Oberon's chamber, but it was wrong. The air was frigid, and a strange, buzzing silence pressed in on her ears, like being underwater. In the corner of the room, the shadows were deeper than they should be. They weren't just dark, they were an absence, a void in the shape of a man. The shadow detached itself from the wall. It had no face, no features, only a shifting, coalescing form like television static. It moved without a sound, gliding over the priceless rug towards her chair. Fear, primal and absolute, paralyzed her. She tried to scream, but her throat was locked. No sound would come out. The air itself felt too thick to vibrate. It raised an arm, a long, tapering limb of pure negation. As it reached for her, a sound tore through the silence. A raw, ragged scream of utter agony. Ianthe's eyes flew open. She was in her own bed, drenched in sweat, the scream still echoing in her ears. It hadn't been her own. It was coming from down the hall, from Oberon's room. She scrambled out of bed and ran, barefoot on the cold stone floors. She threw open his door without thinking. Oberon was thrashing in his bed, tangled in his sheets, his eyes wide with a terror she now understood. He wasn't having a nightmare. He had fallen asleep, even for a moment. "It was here," he gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the corner of the room where the shadow had stood in her dream. "It was going for you. I felt it. It tried to leave." The fugue wasn't just a passenger. It was aware. It knew who she was. The dream hadn't been a dream. It had been an attack. Crow appeared in the doorway behind her, his face pale. The experiment had gone horribly wrong. The creature was learning, adapting. The next few days were a blur of tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. The sessions became fraught, desperate affairs. Ianthe sang with a frantic energy, her eyes constantly darting to the shadows in the room, half expecting one of them to detach and glide towards her. Oberon fought sleep even as her music lulled him, his body torn between exhaustion and terror. The bond between them changed. The polite conversations in the library ceased. Now, his eyes followed her with a desperate, protective fear. He saw her not as a therapist, but as a target, another potential victim he was endangering by his very existence. The guilt was a physical torment, aging him further, carving deeper lines around his haunted eyes. The breaking point came on a storm-lashed evening. The wind howled around the eaves of the manor, and rain beat against the glass like frantic fists. Ianthe was in the music room, trying to find a melody that felt like a shield rather than a weapon, when she heard the crash from Oberon's study. She found him standing over a shattered writing desk, his breath coming in ragged sobs. In his hand, he held a heavy, ornate letter opener, its silver point gleaming in the candlelight. His other hand was pressed against the side of his head, covering his ear. His intent was horrifyingly clear. "Oberon, no!" she cried, rushing forward. He turned to her, his face a mask of resolute despair. "It cannot end," he rasped, his voice cracking. "This cycle, it hears you through my ears. It hates you through my mind. If I cannot hear you..." He was going to destroy his own hearing. He would plunge himself into the very silence that fed the fugue, a final, desperate act of sacrifice to remove her from the equation, to make her irrelevant to the creature. "Don't do this," she begged, her hands outstretched. "That won't save me. It will only unleash it. It is the only way," he roared, a sound of pure anguish that vibrated through her bones. He raised the letter opener, the point aimed directly at his eardrum. She lunged, grabbing his wrist with both hands. He was stronger than he looked, his muscles wiry and tense from centuries of resistance. They struggled, a desperate, clumsy dance around the wrecked furniture. The point of the blade wavered inches from his temple. "Listen to me," she yelled, putting all her force in her grip. "Killing the warden doesn't break the prison. It just opens the door. The problem isn't your hearing. It's this house. It's this agreement your family made. The cycle doesn't end until the cage itself is broken." Her words seemed to pierce through his desperation. His struggles subsided, the tension draining from his arm. The letter opener fell from his grasp, clattering onto the floor. He stared at her, his chest heaving, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but a recognition, a reframing of the problem. He slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I cannot bear it," he whispered, "to be the reason it harms you." "Then we have to find another way," she said, her voice soft but firm, kneeling before him. Together, a profound stillness fell over the room, the storm outside seeming to hold its breath. It was in that sudden, unnatural quiet that she felt it. A drop in temperature, so sharp it raised goosebumps on her arms. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. One of them was wrong. It seeped from beneath the heavy oak door, an inky, silent tide. It wasn't a product of the dying light. It was an active, hungry darkness. Ianthe rose slowly, placing herself between the encroaching shadow and Oberon. Her heart was a frantic drum against the suffocating silence. This was no dream. The fugue was here, awake, and it had finally tired of listening from a distance. It coalesced before them, a towering pillar of visual noise, of utter void. It had no eyes, but she felt its attention on her, a cold, focused malevolence. It saw her not as a person, but as an intolerable frequency, a discordant note that had to be silenced. It glided forward, the priceless rug turning gray and brittle where it passed. Oberon made a choked sound behind her, a gasp of pure terror. She stood her ground, her body trembling, but her resolve hardening into a diamond point of defiance. She would not let it have him. She would not let it win. The shadow, the fugue, the silence-given hunger stopped a foot away from her. The cold it emanated was absolute, a thing of the deep void between stars. Slowly, an appendage of pure darkness extended towards her. It was not aiming for her heart or her eyes. It was aiming for her throat. She felt the touch not as pressure, but as an absence, a patch of impossible cold, a void against her skin directly over her larynx. The sound of her own breathing, the frantic beat of her own pulse. Everything began to recede, fading into a dull, distant hum as if the world were being packed in cotton. It was erasing her, starting with the source of the sound it so hated. The hum was a living thing. It had grown from a background resonance to a physical pressure that pushed against Ianthe's skin, thrumming in the hollows of her bones. Lord Oberon stood in the center of the basement, his body a trembling silhouette against the swirling miasma of black smoke that bled from his pores. The fugue, it was awake. It was hungry. His eyes, wide and lucid for the first time in centuries, found hers. They were filled with a terrifying, desperate plea. "It hears them," he rasped, his voice a discordant chorus of whispers and groans. "The city, it can hear them dreaming." As if on cue, a small battery-powered radio on a dusty shelf crackled to life. Cornelius Crow's voice, shredded by static and panic, tore through the suffocating hum. Every channel is the same. Reports of mass hysteria, waking terrors. They're screaming in their sleep, soul. All of them. What have you done? The smoke coiled, tasting the air. It was no longer formless. Tendrils, sharp as obsidian needles, lashed out, not touching her, but probing the psychic space around her. Memory she had buried rose to the surface, sharp and agonizing. The screech of tires from the accident, the sterile silence of the hospital waiting room. The first time she realized her music could not heal everything. The fugue feasted on the frequencies of her pain. It sang her failures back to her in a pitch only her soul could hear. She raised a silver tuning fork, striking it against her palm. The pure A note it produced was a pinprick of light in an ocean of darkness. The smoke hissed and recoiled, but then it surged, swallowing the note whole, the hum deepening, growing richer, more satisfied. She tried to sing, a lullaby she had used to soothe tormented minds, but the sound was devoured before it left her lips. The air was too thick with the fugue's presence. It was feeding. It was listening. The realization struck her not as a thought, but as a physical blow. Of course, it was a creature of pure sound, a vibration. For it to exist, to have power, it needed a medium. It needed a listener. Oberon was its vessel, but the entire world was its potential audience. She in this room was its anchor. It was performing for her. Her mind raced, tearing through forgotten acoustic theory, through desperate, arcane texts she'd skimmed in Oberon's library. The null note, a sonic paradox, a sound that was the utter absence of sound, a frequency of such impossible purity that it didn't add to the world, but erased from it, creating a vacuum into which all other vibrations would collapse. To produce it would require a perfect storm of diaphragm control, resonant focus, and raw, suicidal intent. It would not be music. It would be annihilation. Listen, the fugue whispered, using Oberon's mouth, the black smoke pouring from his lips like funeral silks. His jaw worked, but the voice was a 1,000-year-old echo. Listen to the song of the end. It is so beautiful. Ianthe saw the single tear that traced a path through the grime on Oberon's cheek. He was in there, a prisoner in the choir of his own damnation. He was begging her, not to save him, to end him. The plan shifted. Her goal was no longer to counter the fugue song. It was to destroy the stage on which it was sung, to break the instrument, to deafen the audience. Permanently, she planted her feet on the cold stone floor, drawing a breath that felt like she was inhaling sand and glass. Her lungs burned, stretched to their absolute limit. This would not be a note. It would be a weapon. She locked eyes with Oberon, a silent promise passing between them. Forgive me. She opened her mouth and screamed. It was not a sound of terror. It was a sound of creation and destruction, a focused pillar of sonic force that erupted from her throat. The very air in front of her seemed to crystallize and then shatter. Dust motes hovering in the lantern light vibrated so violently they vanished. A web of cracks exploded across the stone floor beneath her feet. The glass vials of tinctures and remedies on the shelves did not just break. They atomized, erupting in silent, simultaneous clouds of glittering powder. The fugue recoiled, a physical entity slammed back by a wave of pure, weaponized pitch. It shrieked, a deafening cacophony of every nightmare it had ever consumed. For a single, eternal second, Ianthe's scream met the fugues, and the world was nothing but noise. Then came the pain. A searing, white-hot agony shot through her skull, originating from deep within her ears. It was sharp, precise, and absolute. She felt a sickening, wet pop on her left side, then her right. And then nothing. The shriek of the fugue vanished. The bone-rattling hum was gone. The crackle of the radio, the groan of the ancient house, all of it erased. The world, which a moment ago had been an overwhelming symphony of horror, was now a silent film. She could still see the vibrations. The air shimmered as if above a scorching road. The black smoke of the fugue writhed, contorting in a silent, desperate ballet. It opened a mouth that was not a mouth and bellowed a curse that made no sound. It was still screaming, but the sound waves had nothing to resonate against. The silence she had created was not empty. It was a solid wall, a null space. Ianthe's gaze fell upon Oberon. His mouth was wide, his face a mask of a soundless scream she could feel as a faint tremor in the floorboards. The black smoke, its anchor severed, began to unravel from his body. Without a listener, without a medium, the song could not exist. The fugue thinned, its obsidian form turning to a pale, translucent gray. It reached for her one last time, a gesture of impotent fury, before dissolving completely into the still, silent air. Oberon stopped screaming. His body sagged. the centuries of tension finally releasing. A look of profound, unbelievable peace smoothed the lines on his face. He smiled, a genuine, gentle smile. He looked at Ianthe, his eyes clear and thankful. Then, like a page from a book left in the sun for 1,000 years, he began to crumble. It started at his fingertips, a fine gray dust falling to the floor. The process was not violent, but serene. His form, held together for so long by the tormented energy of the fugue, simply let go. In a matter of seconds, the sleepless king was nothing more than a neat pile of ash on the stone, his final rest earned in a tomb of perfect silence. Ianthe fell to her knees, the impact jarring her, but making no noise. The world was muted, distant, locked behind a pane of impenetrable glass. She raised a trembling hand to her ear, her fingers coming away slick and dark with blood. She tried to say his name, a final eulogy, but felt only the raw vibration in her own throat, a strange, useless rumble that produced nothing. The silence was not a gift. It was a cage. Everything she was, a therapist of sound, a musician, a singer, had been sacrificed. The music of the world, from the grandest symphony to the simplest whisper, was lost to her forever. She was alone in a way she had never thought possible. Slowly, unsteadily, she pushed herself to her feet. Her gaze swept over the basement. The shattered glass, the cracked stones, the pile of ash. This was not a sanctuary. It was a grave. A prison built of notes and nightmares. A deep, cold certainty settled in her gut. A curse this old did not deserve a memorial. It deserved oblivion. Her eyes landed on a heavy, wrought iron candelabra that had been knocked over in the sonic blast. A few of its candles still flickered, their flames dancing silently. She picked it up. The heat was a faint, pleasant pressure against her palm. She walked to the heavy velvet curtains that covered one wall, the fabric thick with the dust of ages. She did not hesitate. She pressed the flames to the cloth. The fire did not roar. It bloomed. A silent, hungry blossom of orange climbed the curtain impossibly fast. It licked at the dry wooden shelves, and ancient books curled into black blossoms before vanishing in bursts of amber sparks. The heat grew, washing over her face, a comforting, physical presence in her new, muted reality. She turned and walked away, her steps making no echo on the stone. She ascended the winding stairs, moving not with the frantic energy of an escapee, but with the calm deliberation of a warden setting her one and only prisoner free. The smoke, thick and gray, billowed silently at her heels, but she did not look back. She passed through the grand ballroom, the library, the foyer, a ghost moving through her own memory. The world outside the tall, arched windows was bright, and it called to her. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the morning. The sunlight was a physical shock, blindingly brilliant after the eternal gloom of the Grimwald estate. The air was cool and crisp against her heated skin. She did not stop. She walked down the gravel path, each step a small, silent crunch felt through the soles of her shoes. A pressure wave, immense and sudden, pushed at her back, making her stumble. She turned. A bloom of orange heat, vast and magnificent, engulfed the sky where the mansion had stood. The roof lifted off in a single, cohesive piece before disintegrating into a million silent shards. A shower of splinters, glass, and stone rained down around her, bouncing and skittering off the gravel without a single pop or clatter. She watched the home of her tormentor, the source of her pain and the vessel of her sacrifice, collapse into a funeral pyre against the blue canvas of the sky. She stood there for a long time, watching the silent embers drift on the wind. Then she turned her back on the inferno and faced the sun. She lifted her face, closing her eyes, feeling its warmth on her eyelids. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the soot and grime on her cheek. The world was quiet. The hum was gone. She was deaf. She was scarred. And for the first time in her life, she was utterly and completely free. If you were moved by this story of sacrifice and the devastating cost of freedom, it's because these are the themes that resonate in the deepest, most silent parts of our own lives. We all have a fugue to battle, a prison to burn down. For more tales that explore the darkness to find the light, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support allows us to keep telling stories that matter.